At 12:13 in the afternoon on June 8, 1943, a terrifying explosion rang out in Hiroshima Bay. A column of black smoke rose hundreds of meters high, shaking the entire peaceful sea area. The ground trembled on nearby shores, and windows shattered in coastal villages. Fishermen working their nets looked up in horror as the thunderous boom echoed across the water. The battleship Mutsu, one of the prides of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had met the greatest tragedy in its existence. Mutsu was a Nagato-class battleship launched in 1920 with a full-load displacement of over 42,000 tons. Armed with 8 16-inch main guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, armor up to 305 millimeters thick, protecting her vital areas, and a maximum speed of 26 knots. Her main battery could hurl shells weighing over a ton at targets more than 40 kilometers away. Together with her sister ship Nagato, Mutsu was a symbol of Japanese naval power in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The ship was named after the ancient Mutsu province, a region of special historical significance to the Japanese people, representing the northern territories of old Japan. The construction of Mutsu had been a national effort. Funded partly by public donations, she represented the aspirations of a nation determined to be counted among the great naval powers. School children had contributed their pocket money, workers had donated portions of their wages, all to help build this magnificent warship. When she was completed, Mutsu embodied not just military might, but the pride and sacrifice of an entire generation of Japanese people. In 1943, World War II was entering its decisive phase. The Battle of Midway in 1942 had marked a turning point when the Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers in a single battle. The strategic situation in the Pacific was gradually tilting toward the Allies. American forces were steadily advancing northward, island by island. Guadalcanal had fallen after months of brutal fighting. The Japanese defensive perimeter was contracting, and the initiative had firmly passed to the United States. In this context, Mutsu was anchored at the Hiroshima base in Hiroshima Bay, along with many other battleships of the combined fleet. However, unlike the glorious days of the past, Mutsu rarely put to sea. The severe fuel shortage forced the Japanese Navy to conserve every drop of oil. Large battleships like Mutsu mostly remained idle in port, waiting for an opportunity for a major decisive battle that might never come. The strategic doctrine of the Japanese Navy had always emphasized the concept of a decisive battle, one climactic engagement where the enemy fleet would be destroyed. But such an opportunity seemed increasingly unlikely as American strategy focused on bypassing strong points and strangling Japan through submarine warfare and air power. Mutsu's role at this time was primarily deterrence, a potential force meant to keep the enemy at bay. The crew still maintained training, ship maintenance, and waited. Daily routines continued. Gun drills without firing live ammunition to save shells, damage control exercises, physical training on deck. The men knew they were among the best trained sailors in the world, serving on one of the most powerful warships ever built. Yet they also sensed the frustration of inaction, watching the war slip away while they sat at anchor. But everyone could sense that the golden age of these giant battleships was gradually drawing to a close. The carrier had proven itself the dominant weapon of naval warfare. The great gun duels between battleships that naval planners had envisioned for decades were not happening. Instead, battles were decided by aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of kilometers away. Mutsu and her sisters were becoming relics of a bygone era, even as they remained formidable fighting machines. The base at Hiroshima was relatively secure, far from the front lines. It offered protection from enemy submarines and aircraft, though air raid drills were conducted regularly. The crew of Mutsu had grown accustomed to the routine of port life, though they remained ready for action at all times. Officers studied tactical manuals and war reports. Enlisted men maintained equipment, stood watches, and wrote letters home. Life aboard a battleship at anchor had its own rhythm, different from the intensity of combat, but no less demanding in its way. June 8, 1943, began like any ordinary day. On Mutsu's deck, 1,121 officers and sailors were carrying out their daily duties. Some were performing maintenance work, checking weapons systems, lubricating gun mechanisms, testing electrical circuits. Others were resting in their quarters, reading letters from home, playing cards, or simply sleeping in the humid heat of early summer. The galley crew was preparing the midday meal, filling the ship with the aroma of rice and miso soup. The weather in Hiroshima Bay was quite nice, the sky clear and blue, the sea calm like a mirror reflecting the surrounding hills. On the bridge, officers maintained the watch, though there was little to watch for in the protected anchorage. The ship's log was updated with routine entries: weather conditions, temperature readings, personnel movements. Everything was as it should be aboard a warship at peacetime anchor. Some men were writing letters home, carefully choosing their words under the watchful eye of censors who would review every line. Others were engaged in the endless task of painting and rust removal that kept a steel ship from deteriorating in the salt air. No one could have imagined that this would be the last day of this legendary battleship. There had been no warnings, no signs of trouble. The ammunition had been properly stored according to regulations. Temperature and humidity in the magazines were within acceptable ranges. All safety protocols had been followed. Yet, somewhere deep in the ship's bowels, in magazine number 3, something was terribly wrong. At 12:13, a violent explosion occurred in magazine number 3 at the stern of the ship. This compartment contained ammunition for turrets number 3 and 4, hundreds of shells and tons of powder charges. The explosion was so powerful that the entire ship shook violently, as if struck by a massive hammer. A massive column of fire shot high into the sky, followed by billowing black smoke that rapidly formed a mushroom cloud, visible for dozens of kilometers. The blast wave rippled across the water, rocking nearby ships at their moorings. But that was only the beginning of the disaster. The initial explosion triggered a chain reaction that no human intervention could stop. The extreme heat and explosive force spread to adjacent ammunition compartments. Bulkheads designed to contain such explosions were overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the detonation. Tons of explosives and artillery shells detonated in succession, each blast feeding the next. The entire stern section was as if torn apart by giant invisible hands. Metal fragments flew in all directions, some large pieces of armor plate and gun barrels thrown hundreds of meters away, splashing into the bay or crashing onto nearby vessels. The aft superstructure simply disintegrated, crew quarters and workspaces ceasing to exist in an instant. Men in those areas had no chance of survival, no time even to understand what was happening. The ship's structure groaned and twisted under forces it was never designed to withstand. Frames bent, rivets popped, plates buckled. Within seconds, Mutsu had transformed from a proud warship to a dying wreck. On deck, the scene was indescribable chaos. Sailors were thrown by the force of the explosion, some hurled overboard into the bay. Those who managed to keep their footing found themselves in a nightmare of smoke, fire, and screaming metal. Toxic smoke and hot vapors spread throughout the compartments, making breathing difficult. The electrical system was damaged. Lights went out throughout much of the ship. Emergency lighting flickered on in some areas, casting eerie shadows. Seawater began flooding in through massive cracks in the hull, the sound of rushing water adding to the cacophony of disaster. Officers tried to maintain order, calling for sailors to escape from the lower compartments. Training took over, and men moved toward their emergency stations despite the chaos. But there was too little time. Mutsu was listing rapidly to one side, the laws of physics inexorably pulling her down. The angle of list increased every second, from 10 degrees to 20 degrees, then 30 degrees. Walking became difficult, then impossible. Those on deck tried to hold on to anything they could: railings, gun mounts, ventilators, as the deck tilted ever more steeply. Below decks was even worse. Men trapped in compartments that were rapidly flooding fought to open hatches that were now at impossible angles. Some managed to escape through scuttles and hatches, pulling themselves up what had been walls but were now floors. Others were not so fortunate, trapped by jammed doors or blocked passageways. The rising water was cold and merciless, filling spaces from bottom to top. The sounds of men pounding on steel, calling for help that would never come, would haunt the nightmares of survivors for the rest of their lives. The warships nearby hurriedly lowered rescue boats, their crews moving with practiced efficiency despite their shock. Sailors aboard Nagato and other vessels watched in horror as their sister ship died before their eyes. Launch after launch hit the water, oars biting into the bay as rescuers raced toward the sinking battleship. But everything happened too fast. Only 4 minutes after the first explosion, Mutsu had completely capsized, rolling over like a dying whale. The massive 42,000-ton hull slowly slid to the bottom of the bay, her bottom now pointing toward the sky, her pagoda mast driving into the mud 40 meters below. Air bubbles rose to the surface along with oil and debris, creating an expanding slick that marked her grave. Then everything fell silent, an eerie quiet settling over the bay, broken only by the cries of men in the water. The survivors were struggling in the cold water, crying for help, swimming desperately away from the suction as the great ship made her final plunge. Rescue boats hurriedly pulled people from the water, strong hands reaching down to grasp the hands of exhausted swimmers. Some sailors were lucky enough to escape from the flooding compartments at the last moment, bursting to the surface, gasping and coughing. Others clung to floating debris, pieces of wood and life rings, anything that would keep them afloat. The water was fouled with oil, making swimming difficult and breathing labored. Some men, injured in the explosion or the chaotic escape, could barely keep their heads above water. The rescue operation continued for hours, boats combing the area for survivors. Every man pulled from the water was a small victory, but each rescue boat that returned to the motherships brought news of men who had been seen but could not be saved, who had slipped beneath the surface before help could reach them. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat survivors, many suffering from burns, broken bones, shock, and oil inhalation. When the final count was made, the casualty figure was extremely heavy. Of the total 1,121 people on board, only 353 survived. 768 people had perished, including Captain Shigenori Ono and most of the senior officers. The captain had been on the bridge when the explosion occurred and went down with his ship, as was tradition and duty. Many officers had been in the wardroom having lunch, and that entire section of the ship had been destroyed in the blast. Engineering officers below decks had no chance of escape. The young sailors, many just boys in their teens, died alongside veterans who had served aboard Mutsu since her commissioning. The official investigation after the incident concluded that the cause was spontaneous combustion in the ammunition magazine. However, determining the exact source of the initial fire was impossible, as most witnesses and evidence had sunk to the seabed with the ship. The investigation board interviewed survivors, examined salvaged debris, and studied reports from observers on nearby ships. But without access to the actual magazine where the explosion originated, they could only theorize. Several hypotheses were put forward, each examined carefully by naval technical experts. First, old ammunition and poor storage conditions. Mutsu had been in service for over 20 years, and many types of ammunition on board may have deteriorated. Explosives stored for long periods in high temperature and humidity conditions can become unstable, their chemical composition gradually changing in ways that increase sensitivity to shock or heat. Cordite propellant charges, in particular, were known to become dangerous over time. Hiroshima in summer was quite hot, and temperatures in the magazine compartments could reach dangerous levels despite ventilation systems. Some batches of ammunition on Mutsu dated back to the 1920s and had been through countless loading and unloading cycles. Second, a technical failure may have occurred during maintenance. Inspecting and moving ammunition always carries inherent risks. A small spark from electrical equipment, a strong impact from a dropped shell, or even static electricity discharge could cause disaster. On the morning of the disaster, routine maintenance had been underway in several parts of the ship. It was possible that some procedure had gone wrong, some safety regulation overlooked, some tool dropped in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigation found no evidence of negligence, but the possibility remained. Third, some raised questions about the possibility of sabotage. However, this hypothesis was rarely accepted, as security on battleships was always tightly controlled. Every person aboard had been thoroughly vetted, and access to sensitive areas like magazines was strictly limited. Moreover, in the context of war, there was no clear motive for such sabotage. Japan was united in the war effort, and dissent was virtually unknown in the military. Still, human nature being what it is, the possibility of a disgruntled sailor or someone who had cracked under pressure could not be entirely ruled out, though no evidence ever emerged to support this theory. The issue of ammunition safety was not new to the navies of various countries. History had witnessed many similar explosions, each one a tragedy that led to investigations and reforms. In 1917, the British battleship HMS Vanguard also suffered a magazine explosion and sank with nearly 900 casualties. In 1911, the French battleship Liberté exploded in Toulon harbor, killing hundreds. In 1916, the Italian battleship Leonardo da Vinci was destroyed by an internal explosion. These tragedies showed that storing thousands of tons of explosives on a ship was always a potential danger, a risk that came with operating battleships. No amount of safety measures could entirely eliminate the danger when such massive quantities of explosive material were concentrated in a confined space. The Japanese Navy had its own specific problems with ammunition design and management. Some types of propellant used had high instability, particularly certain formulations developed in the 1920s. The ventilation and temperature control systems in the magazines were not always sufficiently effective, especially in older ships like Mutsu that had been designed before all the risks were fully understood. And, most importantly, the Japanese military culture of that time tended to prioritize combat effectiveness over absolute safety. Ships were designed to carry maximum ammunition loads, sometimes exceeding what might be considered prudent by more conservative standards. The focus was always on fighting power, on being ready for that decisive battle, rather than on the mundane but crucial matter of safely storing explosives over long periods. News of Mutsu's loss shocked the Japanese Navy to its core. Although information was kept secret from the public for morale reasons, within the Navy, everyone recognized the significance of this loss. Officers whispered about it in wardrooms. Sailors passed the story from ship to ship. The loss of such a prestigious vessel in port without enemy action was deeply embarrassing and troubling. It raised questions about the safety of all ammunition stores throughout the fleet. Materially, losing a battleship the size of Mutsu was significant, though it was not a decisive strategic loss. Japan still had Nagato and the mighty Yamato along with other battleships. The naval balance was not fundamentally altered, but psychologically, losing one of the Navy's symbols in peacetime, not in combat, was a major shock. It seemed like a bad omen, another sign that fortune was turning against Japan. Men wondered if this was divine punishment or simply the cruel hand of fate. The death toll, 768 people, was one of the largest losses of life for the Japanese Navy in a single non-combat incident. Many families lost loved ones without any opportunity for them to fight or sacrifice heroically. Mothers and fathers received the dreaded telegram informing them that their sons would not be coming home. Wives became widows, children became fatherless. But unlike those who fell in battle, there was no glory attached to these deaths, no heroic last stand to commemorate. They had died in an accident, a preventable tragedy. It was a tragedy within a tragedy. The Navy instituted new safety procedures following the disaster, though these came too late for Mutsu's crew. Ammunition handling protocols were reviewed and tightened. Temperature monitoring in magazines became more rigorous. Older ammunition was inspected more carefully and, where possible, replaced. But with the war situation deteriorating and resources scarce, there were limits to what could be done. Ships continued to carry the ammunition they had, and the risk remained. After the war ended, the wreck of Mutsu still lay quietly at the bottom of Hiroshima Bay. At a depth of about 40 meters, the bottom of the ship was inverted, facing upward, her hull a dark presence on the seabed. For decades, she remained there, a metal tomb for hundreds of sailors. Fish made their homes in her corridors, and marine growth slowly covered her steel plates. Local fishermen knew to avoid the area, their nets sometimes snagging on the wreck. In the 1970s and 80s, the Japanese government conducted salvage operations on part of the wreck. Using modern diving equipment and cutting tools, salvage crews carefully removed sections of the ship. Some armor plates, anti-aircraft guns, and other equipment were brought up, covered in rust and barnacles, but still recognizable. Each piece brought to the surface was a tangible connection to that terrible day. The remainder of the wreck was decided to be left in place as an underwater grave, a decision made out of respect for those who still lay entombed within her hull. Disturbing the wreck further seemed disrespectful to the dead. The salvaged artifacts are now displayed at the Mutsu Museum in Tatsuno City, Shimane Prefecture. This museum was established in 1992 to commemorate the warship and those who perished. Visitors can see pieces of her armor, personal effects recovered from the wreck, photographs of the ship in her prime, and detailed models showing her construction. The museum tells the story not just of the disaster, but of the ship's entire service life and the men who served aboard her. In addition, some armor plates from Mutsu are also displayed at the Yamato Museum in Kure, where they serve as sobering reminders of the dangers of naval service. At Hashirajima, where Mutsu sank, there is a small memorial to remember the 768 sailors who lost their lives. A simple stone monument stands near the shore, inscribed with their names. Each year, on June 8th, survivors and victims' families still hold memorial services. They gather to lay flowers, offer prayers, and remember those who never came home. The number of attendees decreases with each passing year, as survivors grow old and pass away, but the memory of Mutsu is still preserved by younger generations who feel a duty to remember. Mutsu did not sink in a heroic naval battle. It did not face enemies on the open sea, did not fire its guns in anger on that final day. This legendary battleship ended in a mysterious explosion in a quiet bay at noon on a summer day. There was no glory in her end, no dramatic last stand against overwhelming odds, just sudden, shocking destruction that claimed hundreds of lives in minutes. 768 sailors perished, not in combat, but in an accident that could have been prevented. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. They were ready to fight and sacrifice for their country, trained and prepared for battle. But fate did not give them that opportunity. Instead, they remained forever at the bottom of Hiroshima Bay, in the wreck of the warship they once proudly served. Their sacrifice was no less real for being unintended, their loss no less felt by those who loved them. The story of Mutsu is a reminder of the cruelty of war, not only on the battlefield, but also what lies behind the scenes. War claims victims in many ways, not all of them direct combat. It is a lesson about safety, about the price of negligence, and about the fragile fate of humans before the things they create. Technology can be powerful and impressive, but it can also be dangerous, especially when safety is compromised by time, wear, or the pressures of war. Today, as the last survivors have grown old or passed away, the task of remembering this history belongs to future generations. Museums, memorials, and stories passed down ensure that Mutsu and the 768 brave men will not be forgotten. They are part of history, part of the collective memory of an era full of turbulence and sacrifice. Their story deserves to be told, not to glorify war, but to honor those who served and to remind us of the human cost of conflict and the importance of safety even in times of crisis.